Okay, I'm fine. Thank you all very much for coming here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia here at NYU. Super excited to have everyone who's here in person, excited to have everyone who's here joining us virtually, excited to have everyone who's watching the YouTube video afterwards. And we are absolutely delighted to have another one of our continuing series of conversations with Yevgenia Albats. And here today we have Angela Stent here. Jen is going to introduce her. But I just wanted to thank everyone on behalf of the Jordan Center and turn it over to Yevgenia. And for those of you who haven't been to one of these before, this will essentially be a conversation between the two of them for the first half of the time, for a decent amount of time, and then we'll open it up to questions. So those of you who are watching on Zoom, feel free to use the Q&A component of the webinar to leave questions. We'll be able to see them here, but this is going to start off as a conversation between Yevgenia and Angela. So without further ado, Yevgenia, take it over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you very much, Jordan Center, for giving me this excellent opportunity to work here and and to do this series of interviews. But first of all, I'm very glad to welcome Professor Angela Stent. Angela, thank you very much for doing this and for coming. And I hope that I am absolutely aware that those who do Russian studies or East European studies, they of course they know Angela Stent, and she doesn't require any special introduction. For those who are not that much familiar with our field, Angela Stent is the director emerita of the center. Emerita, is it correct? Emerita, okay. Director Emerita of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and Professor Emerita of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She has been teaching at Georgetown for as long as I remember myself. In fact, coming to the United States, Angela was teaching at Georgetown. She's also a senior fellow at Brookings Institute as well. She has been teaching Russian politics to generations of students. In between, she was a national intelligence officer, meaning she was to analyze intelligence information coming from my part of the world. And of course, I'm extremely curious to get to know how did she do this. And she provided her analysis to the decision makers in the United States. Her recent book, she wrote quite a few books, but her recent book is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. It came out in 2019. A month before the start of the war in Europe, Professor Stent wrote a piece in the Foreign Affairs titled Putin's Doctrine, in which she argued that the war between Russia and Ukraine, quote, is a reckoning that has been 30 years in the making. It's about much more than Ukraine and its possible NATO membership. It's about the future of European order. Once again, it was written a month. It was published January 27th. The war started on February 24th. I translated it for the New Times, so I was stunned to read this. The second article, Professor Stent co-authored with Fiona Hill, formerly the Senior Director for Europe and Russia on the US National Security Council. And this article is titled The World Putin Wants. You can get it on Foreign Affairs. It's an excellent and very, very detailed article. And so I advise anyone, who is interested in what is happening in Europe and in this war, which Russia is running in Ukraine and against Ukraine. And, when you read this article, basically Angela and Fiona, they write that it's much broader war than just, against Ukraine. Anyway, so I definitely advise you to read it because it gives you a lot of information, a lot of argument, and I will just ask you several questions. I understand that it's that you wouldn't be able to repeat the article, but at least please, what does Putin want? What is his end game? No, I'm serious. Yes.
No. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Josh, and I'm delighted to be doing this. Before I answer that question, you jogged a memory, and it's amazing to think that this happened in 2004 when I joined the National Intelligence Council. A delegation from Russia came with Konstantin Kozachov and a few other people, and they wanted to know what was it like to have a National Intelligence Council, and should Russia have one? And I remember the head of the National Intelligence Council and the chair of that, Robert Hutchings, and I and several other people sat down with them. It just shows you what life was like then, very different now. And I don't think they ever did, but they wanted to know what it was.
Yeah, but were you receiving intelligence information from different intelligence audiences?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you been receiving intelligence information from all this, this community of, you have 17, by now you have 17, the family of 17 intelligence agencies?
Well, so what the National Intelligence Council does is it coordinates, all the researchers, and it produces something called National Intelligence Estimates. And the most infamous one was in 2003, which was the one that said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which, as we now know, he didn't. So when I got there, there was, as they say, samocritica, and everybody had to think about why they'd gotten this wrong. Anyway,
okay,
let's come back to what Putin wants.
Okay.
So I mean, I think initially we know now that what he wanted at the beginning was to, subjugate Ukraine. So he thought that they would go in, they would take Kyiv, 3 to 5 days. We know that the officers and the enlisted men had their celebratory uniforms with them, which they were going to wear shortly thereafter in a Victory Day parade. And then they thought the regime changed. So he had been talking about intelligence. He was obviously, must have been advised by his FSB people there that, there would be a government in waiting, that they would welcome the Russians, and that Zelensky would flee. He'd go somewhere else. So I think so that was the initial goal there, was to, essentially eradicate a separate Ukrainian national identity, and to make sure that Ukraine didn't, gave up wanting to join the West, European Union, NATO, give up its relationships with different NATO countries in the United States. So that was to have, a subordinated Ukraine. Now, I think we speculate, Fiona and I, that probably that was phase one, at least maybe in his mind, of a broader goals of possibly creating a new kind of Slavic union of Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, maybe northern Kazakhstan, which is heavily Slavic. But it's really to relitigate and undo essentially the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of post-Cold War settlement. Because I don't believe that he's ever accepted, and he's not the only one, obviously, that the Soviet Union collapsed, or that it somehow legitimately collapsed. And then, as he called it, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, because you had 25 million Russians living outside of Russia. So I think it's to go back and undo what happened in the past 30 years. We can go further, and if we listen to what Putin said just a couple of months ago, likening himself to Peter the Great, and saying that it was legitimate to take back territories that used to belong to Russia. He was talking about Peter and Poltava and the Baltic states. You can speculate about how much he thought he was going to take back. But I mean, I think this was supposed to be the first move, again, to undo essentially the unraveling of the Soviet Union. And if you look at the treaties that were presented, the draft treaties that were presented to the United States and NATO in December, there, he's actually saying, well, NATO should go back to where it was in 1997. In other words, undo the entire NATO enlargement, including Poland. So that, and since then, he said more explicitly that, Poland, Central Europe is also not off limits. But that would have been part of a grander scheme. But of course, now, he hasn't been able to take all of the Donbass yet. But I think that's what he wanted on February 24th.
Right. But, you also write in your article that they changed borders.
Sorry, really quickly, we're having a comment from someone on Zoom that we're hearing some interference.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll switch something really quickly. I'm so sorry for the interruption.
no problem. Okay.
Yeah.
You write in your article that Putin has been changing his claims because at the beginning of the war, Russia was talking about Donbass, and Lugansk, right? Now, then they've been talking about South, Ukrainian South. And Lavrov, you cite Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov, who said, the territorial borders are changing, stuff like that.
Right.
So then you write that you couldn't exclude that Putin may decide to turn Ukraine into landlocked country, to deprive it of all ports, and so that Ukraine won't be able to build self-sufficient country. So what do you think? What is he going to do? Yes, and of course, then you say that he can go and occupy Moldova and etc. What do you think he's going to do?
Well, I mean, given how badly the Russian military has performed, and the fact that the Ukrainian military has done very well, at the moment, it looks like he's focusing on the Donbass, on the newly annexed regions, Kherson, being very important in terms of Crimea and supplying it and things like that. But that doesn't mean that those other goals aren't there. I mean, I think they would be interested in, taking Odessa, which would make it almost impossible really for Ukraine to survive economically if it doesn't have access to any of its ports. Moldova, they say different things, and they do that deliberately. They want to keep people guessing. They want to keep people off base. I mean, I don't know what's in his mind, but I think there are a variety of goals that they have, and if they can achieve one of them, then they would go on to the next one. But the truth is they haven't managed to achieve very much at all. I mean, they have taken some more Ukrainian territory, but the Ukrainians are taking some of that back now in the Kharkiv region, in Kherson, although I think that's a very difficult fight at the moment. But I think by annexing, quote unquote, annexing those 4 territories, it's going to be much harder than, if there were to be any negotiations or settlements for Ukraine to say, well, these are Ukrainian, they're not Russian. I mean, we don't have any experience of, on these various frozen conflicts that we've seen, whether it's Abkhazia and South Ossetia, whether it's Transnistria, whether it's the Donbass region, of rolling them back, right? We don't know, what would happen if they were no longer frozen conflicts, or at least under Russian control. So I just think that there's, I think that the goals and what they say they want to do is changing all the time.
Right, but we know that American intelligence performed great because apparently reading Foreign Minister Kuleba, Foreign Minister of Ukraine, and all those articles in the Washington Post, we understand that American intelligence did know that in fact Russians were about to invade Ukraine when everybody else basically thought, no, it's not going to happen. But apparently in September, Jack Sullivan told Kuleba that Russians are going to invade. In December, head of the CIA, Bill Burns, came to Moscow and warned the Russians that they knew that Americans knew that Russians were going to invade. Now we assume that Americans have a very good intelligence somewhere in a very close proximity to Putin, or at least we think, because from what we read. Do you think that your people know what is the real end game? In Washington, you were the in the national security, national intelligence officer. Fiona Hill was a national security officer. You guys should know something. Just tell us.
Well, first of all, who knows what's in Putin's mind, right? I mean,
Apparently you do.
Well, I mean, that's very difficult. You know, we do know that in this war, he really is the decision maker, the decider. He, you know, most of his close colleagues didn't know there was going to be a full-scale invasion, right? So right from the beginning, he's kept most of the other people in the dark about what his next move is. You know, I think that I would think the answer to that is obviously people are speculating and they're trying to figure out what it is he might do next. But it's deliberately, you know, such an opaque system. And, you know, there are so few people who know, maybe nobody knows what he's going to do next. So my hunch would be that, you know, we can have educated guesses about what he might want to do, but there's no certainty about what he would do because, you know, and even with the intelligence, it was very good intelligence. The intelligence services says Putin is amassing troops, and the only explanation for the way he's doing this in Belarus, etc., is for a full-scale invasion. But they will tell you themselves that until February the 24th, they weren't completely sure that there was going to be the full-scale invasion. I mean, there were some who thought maybe it would be, you know, the Donbass in the beginning. So they and Bill Burns, if you know, he spoke at the Aspen Security Conference, I think in July. You can watch that on YouTube. And he also said, you know, that they thought this was going to happen, but that he believed that when he saw Putin hadn't made his mind up yet. And he's got on the record saying that. So,
okay, yeah. But at the same time, you know, praising the U.S. intelligence, we should say that, you know, a lot of reports that I read back then assured us that Ukrainians were not able to resist, that they were going to lose the war in 3 days. Even, you know, Michael Kaufman, you know, the head of, you know, the Russia desk in the CNA, you know, this US Navy think tank, who was predicting the war and who spoke at my Echo Moskvy show and kept saying, you Russian liberals, you don't understand the truck already running at you, and you keep discussing the noise of its engine. He wrote, and he said in one of his presentations that Ukrainians will be able to resist for several days, maybe a little bit longer, but that's it. So why was this estimation?
Well, and then we also overestimated the prowess of the Russian military. I mean, I think,
but that's what you tend to do. You did the same during the World War II.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So Putin may have overestimated, but I think the US did too, because the natural tendency, particularly when you work obviously in an intelligence agency, is to make sure that you're not blindsided by something that you didn't see, and therefore to exaggerate maybe the strength of a potential enemy. I can only say on the Ukrainian side, even though, of course, there had been, you know, they had been trained by different NATO countries, maybe, and of course, they have been fighting. I mean, they've been fighting in the Donbass since 2014. But I think they maybe underestimated the degree to which the Ukrainian morale would be so strong. I mean, it's partly their military effectiveness, but it's also their will to fight. And I think that was probably underestimated too, because if you look at, you know, what was happening in Ukraine over the last 30 years, and even the day before the war, you know, Zelensky's popularity was 25%. He wasn't doing well. There's always been a problem of corruption in Ukraine. There were, you know, concerns about what was happening domestically in Ukraine. And so that probably fed into a supposition, really, that the Ukrainian armed forces maybe wouldn't be as capable as they were. And what Zelensky managed to do, right, is to really unite everyone behind him. And as you know, it's still 90% of Ukrainians, I think, say, however bad it is, they got to keep fighting until they take the territory back. So I think that was something that nobody understood, because they hadn't been tested like that before.
And when did you understand?
So I think, I mean, it didn't take too long. Zelensky obviously emerged as an extremely effective leader. And then just watching, you know, what they were doing on the battlefield. I mean, I mean, they also obviously had reverses, but they managed to, the fact that the Russians couldn't take Kyiv, you know, that was point one, even if they committed these atrocities in the suburbs, still that already showed that the Ukrainian army was capable of pushing them back.
So United States realized pretty early into the war that Ukrainians were capable to resist. Why you didn't close their skies?
Well, because as you know, a major point in the Biden administration, their major plank here is that the US should not get involved directly with Russia in this fight because we're two nuclear superpowers. And therefore the argument for not closing the skies was having a no-fly zone would be if there was some, unintended clash between a NATO plane and a Russian one, that could lead to that could escalate the conflict. It's quite controversial, and there are people who believe that the Biden administration should have closed the skies, but they've been pretty adamant that there are certain, they wouldn't call them red lines, and the other one is not providing the Ukrainians with the wherewithal to hit deep into Russian territory. In other words, with with military equipment that could do that. These rockets, even the HIMARS, they have different capabilities, but the ones that we're providing them, doesn't enable them to do that. So, and that until now has been, and I think there's been restraint even until now. I mean, I think there is more that the US could be doing in terms of now air defenses and things like that the Ukrainians need. And they've been a little bit slow, but on the other hand, the US is providing by far the lion's share of all the equipment to the Ukrainians. I mean, the Poles are doing pretty well, the Brits are, but the rest of the Europeans, not so much.
And they don't do this so much because they don't have, or because they don't want, or because they're afraid of Putin?
Well, it depends. Some of them don't have. I mean, it really reveals, that so many European countries haven't invested enough in their own military. Germany is obviously the prime example here. They've now said they're going to spend 2% on the military. They have slowly been providing some things to the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are not happy about the amount that they've received from the Germans. I think now there are a few more air defense systems going there. The Germans haven't provided them with tanks, but then US hasn't provided them with tanks either. So I think it's partly just lack of actual equipment. And then in the German case, it's still, going back to, everything that's happened really since World War II, this self-imposed restraint about not getting militarily involved in conflicts. And it takes them a long time to sort of get over that. And there's still a debate going on in Germany about that.
Yeah, you were just in Germany.
Yeah. I mean, there's still a debate. And people are trying to push the chancellor.
And there is a debate because Germans are afraid that they will be accused of killing Russians who they killed en masse back 70 plus years ago. Why?
Right. So there is some of that there on the left, certainly. Well, first of all, so, the extreme right wing and a lot of people in East Germany are still very much pro-Russian. But in the Social Democratic Party, too, they have been slow to change the kind of narrative that when, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, they were responsible for millions of Russian deaths, forgetting that they invaded, through Ukraine and Belarus, and they're also responsible for millions of Ukrainian and Belarusian deaths, right? So that is changing now, that narrative is changing, but that is still part of the sort of responsibility for what happened in World War II. But younger generations, I think, see that differently.
Okay. We see that, and we read in foreign press, and there are some reports in the Russian emigre media, because obviously, inside the country, none almost existed. That Russian troops lacking weapons and ammunition, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, there was overestimation on the part of the American analysts and on the part of European and Russian analysts about the possibility, about the reforms that were conducted in the Ministry of Defense, and et cetera, et cetera. Everybody were talking about that Russia had the second army in the world, and it turned out it had the second army in Ukraine. So Now, but and people say that Putin is going to run out of missiles pretty quickly. You know, he still have a lot of Soviet-made missiles, but all these new ones, he's basically running out of them. Would you expect him to use nukes in this case?
I mean, so first of all, of course, he is now getting ammunition from North Korea, right, and drones from Iran.
Iran, yes.
So, and as far as we know, even China isn't supplying weapons because we, the US, have warned the Chinese if they do that, then they're going to be subject to major sanctions. Will he use nuclear weapons? So I think you cannot discard totally the possibility that he would. If you look at it rationally, you would have to ask, what would he gain by that? Well, he'd obviously intimidate the Ukrainians and their neighbors. Russia would also presumably, depending on which way the winds are blowing, suffer some radioactive fallout too. In other words, yes, the Ukrainians would be affected by this, but presumably Russians and other countries in the region would be.
You expect Putin to care about that? Thousands of dead Russians?
All right.
Please.
Okay, maybe I'm being overly sentimental here. So no, but then the thing is, if you use nuclear weapons, it doesn't really help you gain territory. And if you talk about using a tactical nuclear weapon, there's been a taboo, for 77 years on all of this. You could to think that using a quote unquote, tactical nuclear weapon wouldn't escalate into something greater. I mean, we don't know that. And I'm not an expert on these things, but I mean, that's what my colleagues who are saying. It couldn't be necessarily contained. I mean, we don't know. So there are many, and then, what would the reaction of Russia's partners be to this? The Chinese, the Indians, all of these countries that have not condemned or sanctioned Russia, they wouldn't be particularly happy about Russia breaking this taboo. So there are a lot of reasons where you would have to question what is the utility of doing this. But on the other hand, Russia, Russia's doing badly militarily. We haven't talked about, or you asked me what's in Putin's mind. There's some people, who believe that he, if he gets desperate, he might do that. All these people who say Russia can't lose, and therefore he would do that. Whether that would mean that Russia would win the war is also not clear. So in other words, I can't say to you that he wouldn't use a nuclear weapon, but I think most people believe he's not going to do it yet. That doesn't mean he would never do it. But, what he's trying to do is to get everyone so intimidated by this that the US will primarily say to the Ukrainians, look, you have to negotiate. You can't go on fighting like this because, President Biden said it himself, we may be in for Armageddon. And the very fact that he said that, President Biden, I was slightly surprised by that because that's already sort of raising the stakes there. On the other hand, our experts are all saying that there's no proof that they have, no evidence yet that Russia's preparing to do this. But that's nuclear weapons. But of course, what we've had in the past, week or two is suddenly all these messages about Ukraine's going to use a dirty bomb. It's not a nuclear weapon, but it certainly can cause a lot of destruction. And to have Shoigu actually call his counterparts in Europe, the US, Turkey, China, India, and mention it in the United Nations. So it becomes a thing, right? Now we're discussing, are the Ukrainians going to use a dirty bomb? And of course, what Zelensky said and others have said is, if you want to know what the Russians are going to do, listen to what they say that the Ukrainians and the West are going to do, and they'll do it. But even that, that would still be very destructive. And frankly, what the Russians are doing at the moment, the way that they're bombing all of the infrastructure, they're, particularly the electricity grids, they can cause a tremendous amount of damage to the civilian population. They're already doing that without having to, use a dirty bomb or something like that. So this is meant to intimidate. And, Putin is still hoping, I think, you ask me what's in his mind, that as winter comes, And as you know, you're different Europeans. We were talking before the session that the Germans seem to have worked out, at least this winter, their own energy supplies, but there are other European countries where it may not work that well. And so it will be cold. People, won't have enough energy. They'll be freezing, inflation, we're in for an inflation recession, and all of that will cause European publics to say to their governments, this is too much. We've been supporting Ukraine, but that's it. Plus, in this country, we'll have midterms in 2 weeks. We don't know what will happen if Republicans control one or both houses. We know that the potential Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has said that no blank check for Ukraine. So I think this is part of the the nuclear weapons question is part of it. Putin in general wanting to do everything he can to break any Western consensus on this, particularly in the US, but in Europe too. And of course, we know that if the NATO countries don't continue to provide Ukraine with these weapons, it's going to be very difficult for them to continue what they're doing.
Correct. Right. But you also, I think, you should give Putin a credit and his people. They managed to control the narrative in the United States because, for a while, all the American media were talking about, the possibility of the nuclear war. And so when newspapers got tired of this news that Russia is about to start a nuclear war, then they turned into this dirty bomb narrative. And you think, God, Putin is genius almost. He's so good in switching attention. Instead of talking about 30% of nuclear power plants destroyed in Ukraine and thousands of civilians and kids killed in the Ukrainian cities, the entire Western media community is talking about dirty bomb, which doesn't exist or probably doesn't exist. But you should be credit, they're smart people. They're
if you say so. If you say so.
But talking about the American response. Elon Musk and Bill Ackman have publicized the idea of the land for peace. It is that Ukraine should give up some of its territories, whether all, 4 annexed territories or the Crimea, and in exchange for peace. So I have 2 questions here. First of all, what do you think about this idea? Will Putin be satisfied? Will you be able to feed the tiger and contain him, or what's going to happen with this?
Well, I think if you look at, the past behavior of Putin over the 22 years he's been in office, there's really nothing to make you believe that if they did sign a land for peace deal, let's say they signed an agreement and the Ukrainians said, all right, we have to give up Kherson, but we keep the rest or whatever. And the Russians said, yes, it's going to be peace. I mean, how long is that going to last? I mean, they've been fighting in Ukraine since 2014. They had, the Minsk agreements never worked out because neither side was willing to do what they were supposed to do. It's not just the Ukrainians, but there's nothing to make one believe. I mean, go back and read Putin's 5,000-word article from last year. What he says about Ukraine. Why would you think that he's going to give up on the idea of taking all of Ukraine? So I think, this is why there was a potential deal in sort of March and early April. There were various conversations. The last one was in Istanbul, brokered by Erdogan. And the outlines of that deal at that point were that Russia would withdraw to where it was on February 23rd. Ukraine would say that it will never join NATO. And there would be security guarantees for Ukraine. It was unclear how many different countries. The Ukrainians at one point wanted Russia and China to guarantee its security. But anyway, the idea that Ukraine would get security guarantees.
Really? Ukraine got security guarantees in 1993, Budapest Agreement.
Yes.
United States, and Great Britain
Right.
and Russia
but
gave security guarantees to Ukraine.
No, but and this time the Ukrainians wanted a security guarantee that would be essentially like Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is that, in fact, other countries would come to their defense if they were attacked by another power. So that deal was there, and then it collapsed, partly because I think the Russians weren't interested in it, partly because thereafter there was Mariupol, there was Bucha, all of those things that I think stiffened the Ukrainian resolve not to give this up. And now that kind of deal isn't there anymore. So Elon Musk, it was interesting. I was at a conference a few weeks ago. Elon Musk was there and he was being interviewed about something completely different, space exploration, what it's going to be like to live on Mars. And at the end of the interview, he, apropos of nothing, said, oh, and by the way, I have a peace plan for Ukraine. And then he tweeted it out, I think, a few days later, right? Which is, you hold the referendum again in the referenda again in the 4 annexed territories. And if people decide that they actually, with international monitors, and if people decide they don't want to be part of Russia, you let that go. I think that was probably his own idea. But then, Crimea is Russian forever. Ukraine has to make sure that Crimea gets supplied with water, all of these other things. And so I think one can only assume this, that this gentleman must be in contact with the Kremlin and, have some ideas about this. But it's just very, as I say, I think it's very hard at this point to see how this works. And as you probably know, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party wanted to release a letter this week, also talking about negotiations and land for peace. And then there was such an outcry against it that they took the letter back. So that doesn't mean, when people say all wars end 2 ways, either one country is conquered and it's, and the victor takes the spoils, or it's a negotiation. But how would we have any trust that Russia would uphold its part of a negotiation like this? And if not, then you would still have to have very robust security, if not guarantees for Ukraine, but assistance to it.
Okay. Do you think that Elon Musk was played out by Putin?
Well, I think there are a number of individuals, including Henry Kissinger, who meet. He used to meet with. Yeah, he used to meet with Putin.
Sorry.
Yeah, he used to meet with Putin. But I think he's still. There are a number of high-level individuals that are in communication with Putin. Let's put it that way. So.
Okay. So.
Yeah.
Okay. There are some people, here in the United States who would say, Ukraine is not the West. Ukraine is not part of the NATO. Why should we use taxpayers' money to supply all these weapons to Ukraine, to create ourselves problems, and et cetera, et cetera? What would be your response to that?
I think my response to that would be, if Russia is able, to conquer Ukraine as it wanted to, it's not going to stop there. We come back to what we said at the beginning. And therefore, this really, the European security system has broken down. And therefore, you can say, well, we're far away in the United States and it doesn't really concern us, but you would have much more instability in Europe. We don't know where Putin's next, foray would be. It certainly affects our allies. And to the extent that, we believe in our NATO alliance with our allies and it makes everyone stronger, it does concern us. That would be my response.
Okay. Putin today at the Valdai conference, this very Valdai conference, which was such a great attraction to so many Western journalists and policymakers and academics. So today he gave a speech. And in this speech, he basically said, that there is, there is Eurasia and there is, how did he put it? That Europe is an extremity of Eurasia. So it's just the edge of Eurasia. That's exactly the exact translation. Yes, the exact translation. Sort of province of big Eurasia. He also said that basically Europe is a colony of the United States, that Europe no longer is capable to make its own foreign policy decisions, etc. So basically they're basically a colony of the United States. However, he also spoke about, about this global South, and not you in your article, you wrote a lot about the global South. And basically, even Putin didn't say global South, but he was referring to what you call global South. So what are your expectations? Because in your article, you said that Global South doesn't see this war as something dangerous to them. However, we know that Prime Minister Modi of India at the recent meeting in Samarkand expressed his dissatisfaction with this war. So what are your expectations about the Global South, and what do you think, what kind of China policy will be towards this war after Chairman Xi got re-elected for the next 5 years?
Sure, and let me just say, so this is the first Valdai I have not been to since 2004.
I didn't say what you said.
And what's so interesting is that until this year, Valdai was mainly, there were Americans, there were Europeans, Chinese certainly, a few Japanese, very few Central Europeans. And then it changed slightly. The last one I attended in person was 2019, where they suddenly invited a group from Africa, because then they had the first Russia-Africa summit, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This year's Valdai, I think there may be one or two Europeans there who obviously are very pro-Putin, but all the delegations are now it's either from China, they're from the Middle East, they're from Latin America, they're from Africa. So this is the Global South. And by the way, that's not my term. I mean, people use that term. It's maybe not the best term to use, but so.
But you did use it in
I used it in my article. So for many of these countries, they look at the Ukraine war, Russia war, and they say this is a European conflict. Interestingly enough, most of these countries do not view Russia as a colonial power. I mean, they think the Europeans were colonial powers, the United States is a colonial power, but Russia was, they know nothing. They don't understand about how Russia conquered, its neighboring territories. So for them, this is a European war. They say there's a lot of hypocrisy. They say, to the United States, what about Vietnam? What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? So why are you accusing the Russians of doing things that you've done? So there's a whole argument there, be it in Africa or the Middle East or Latin America. And by the way, Mexico, hasn't signed on to any of these sanctions either. And the Mexican parliament created a Mexican-Russian caucus after the invasion. Anyway, so the narrative there is that, why should they sanction Russia or condemn Russia? It's just doing what great powers do. So far, if you look at the voting patterns in the United Nations, right? So the same number of countries early on condemned Russia, and then recently with the annexations refused to recognize them. And then you have the abstentions. So countries like China, India, most of the BRICS, I think Brazil actually didn't abstain, but South Africa, most of the BRICS, they have voted in the same pattern. It was interesting that Modi did choose to say publicly to Putin at the SCO conference there that this is not the time for war. And Putin felt the need to preemptively say that the Chinese weren't totally happy with what was happening, which was quite interesting too. So if you look at China, what has China done? It supports everything rhetorically, right? It says this is a war. Russia had no choice to go to war. NATO was provoking Russia, so it supports all the rhetoric, and it supports the rhetoric about US biolabs in Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. But they're not supplying weapons as far as we know, because again, they've been warned not to. And they are being very careful not to break the Western sanctions, because they don't want to be subject to secondary sanctions. So in fact, Huawei has withdrawn quite a lot of its people from Russia. They're being very careful not to do anything that would put them at odds with the US and the Europeans and the Asian allies on the sanctions. But still, I think you can see now that with this 10th Party Congress and Xi Jinping consolidating his control, they're not going to give up on Russia. And I think for someone like Xi Jinping, the nightmare would be if Russia loses and Putin's replaced by someone who, I mean, it seems, unimaginable at the moment, if Putin's replaced by someone who rethinks what Russia should be doing. Maybe we shouldn't have such an antagonistic relationship with the West. Maybe we don't want to be, the junior partner to China. Now, none of us think that's very likely, but for the Chinese, then they're back in a situation where it's them against, somehow the US and Russia. So, I think they don't want to see this fail, and they want to see the current regime in Russia stay in power. Now, India is a different case. India is a member of the Quad, with the Japanese, with the Australians and the United States. And I've talked to, the Japanese about that, and they're very, perplexed by the fact that the Indians will not sort of condemn what Russia is doing. And in fact, the Indians have now taken advantage of cheap Russian oil that they're getting and greatly increased their imports from Russia. So I think the US will continue to try and persuade the Indians in this format, maybe you should rethink that. But, they have a lot of significant economic interest with Russia. India has always been a major purchaser of Soviet arms, Russian arms. South Africa, I think they still see, I remember in the previous Valdai when Thabo Mbeki was there and he embraced Putin, and they still see Russia as the heir of the Soviet Union that supported their national liberation struggle. So, so I think this will continue. I don't think we should expect that any of these countries will suddenly rethink the relationship with Russia, even if it were to use a nuclear weapon.
But it's possible, sort of the return to this Cold War situation when, United States on the one hand and Soviet Union on the other hand controlled, each half of the world. Is it possible that, we will return back to this sort of thing?
I don't think so, because I think, nobody's going to, during the Cold War, basically many of these countries were forced to choose, right? You either choose the Soviet Union or the United States. It's much more complicated now because A, China is a major player, and B, you don't have the same ideological or even sort of economic division. So I think a large number of these countries will prefer just to remain neutral, non-aligned. I mean, that does sound like the Cold War, and not having to choose sides.
I see.
So I think that's where it's changed. The same is true for Latin America. I mean, during the Cold War, obviously most of Latin America, with the exception of Cuba, was very much tied to the United States. Look at what's happened in Latin America now. You have a number of leftist governments who don't want that kind of relationship with the United States.
In today's speech, Putin condemned the US for killing General Soleimani of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of, stressed out the Kremlin's unity with Iran. Would you expect some new alliances here, like, some another incarnation of axis of powers of sorts?
So it's very interesting that the Iranian-Russian relationship has really strengthened since the war. From the, as we've said, the Iranians are providing drones to the Russians, and I think they're Iranian technicians in Crimea, at least that's what one has read. So that has, it's great for the Iranians because, Russia now needs things from them, like the drones, and they're getting money for them. I would have said before the war, Russia and Iran were working together to support Assad, but there were a lot of differences. The Iranian public doesn't like Russia very much, but we're not talking about them. If you look at, not that there's huge public opinion polling, but in general, the Iran specialists say, if you read what they write, Russia isn't that popular, but there's a huge reason for both the Russian and the Iranian leadership to get closer together. So I think this is something that will change. And I used to think that when the Syrian war was over, you would have more clashes between Russia and Iran because they don't necessarily have the same goals for a post-war Syria. But I think that's also changing now. And I think the other country, I talked about North Korean ammunition going to Russia. Yeah. North Korea seems to be getting a pass now in terms of, its nuclear program and things like that. I think that's also being reassessed both by China and by Russia, in view of the consequences of this war.
Interesting. My last question then,
Mhm.
because, it's time to give our audience the possibility to ask you questions. The latest article in the Foreign Affairs is titled, Could America Win a New World War? Do you really expect that there will be a new world war?
I don't think so. I mean, what? I mean, that would only be in a scenario if there was the use of a strategic nuclear weapon by Russia, not a tactical nuclear weapon, and the US had to respond. But I don't see a new world war.
Thank you. Good news. Good news. Okay, now, please, we're open floor to the questions. And first, from here in NYU, and then we will go for questions from our audience on the website. Yes, Amy Knight, please.
So you were talking about whether or not Putin would decide possibly to resort to using either a dirty bomb or a strategic nuclear weapon. And then in general, there's just kind of an assumption that this is Putin's war and that he's making all the decisions. And to a certain extent, I mean, I agree that unfortunately, he is making most of the decisions. But is there a possibility, and let's just take the nuclear example. Suppose that Putin decided he wanted to do this. This was there. Presumably, there would be people who would object to this. And what I'd like to know is whether or not you feel that there's any room at the top for some sort of grouping that would, say this is too much, and possibly Mr. Putin to maybe say that he's ill and exit the stage, or do you consider the ruling elite to be and not capable of making any decisions or changes that would go counter to President Putin?
So these are both great questions. So I asked someone who is a real expert on the nuclear command chain. I said, well, surely in Russia, there's a command. I mean, if you really did want to detonate a nuclear weapon, people have to sign off on it. And he looked at me and said, not necessarily. He said, in that system, which is so highly personalized and where Putin seems to have so much of the levers of power, if he said he wanted to do that, there wouldn't be, no one could really object to it. Now, I'm just repeating what was told to me, and I don't know whether that's true, but I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that there are checks and balances there in terms of using a nuclear weapon. And I think, and so I asked, is this true both of a tactical and a strategic nuclear weapon? And I think the answer is with a tactical nuclear weapon, I think we know less about what the chain of command would be. Now, in terms of, people around him getting together and saying, this can't go on like this. So, in 1964, when they wanted to get rid of Khrushchev, they had a Politburo and they had a central committee. There were institutions. So they got together, of course, behind his back, and they voted him out and they presented him with a fait accompli, and that was it. There is no such institution. Right. I mean, I know there's a Security Council, but there are no institutions similar to the ones of the Communist Party anymore in Russia. And it is a highly personal system. And one would have to imagine that the small group of people around him, be they the defense minister, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Narishkin, the normal names, would they really be able to get together and agree amongst themselves that he should go? And then how would they do that? What would the mechanism be? So that's why the palace coup scenario seems less likely to me. That doesn't mean that there aren't people around whom I'm sure think that they would be better off with a leader who hasn't committed these tremendous mistakes. But I don't think they really have the power to do anything about it. Do you agree or not?
Well, I do to a certain extent.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, if we look back at the example of Khrushchev, I mean, there would have to be any kind of a forcible coup, i.e. somebody just walking in, a group of them walking into Putin's office and saying, you gotta leave, you gotta leave, would require some support from the troops, either the National Guard, the Federal Security Service, or the military. So I would assume that I think it would be very difficult to get Putin to do anything unless there was backup from these forces. And I don't see at this point that the National Guard under Zolotov or any of the FSB troops or even the MVD would be inclined, to move against Putin. But I'm just wondering if perhaps within the military itself, and this is something I would be interested in your opinion. Is it possible that, because obviously these generals have not done well, but there must be a lot of dissatisfaction also on their part, because they might be feeling that they've been fighting to a certain extent with their hands tied behind their back, that they were given these goals that they couldn't achieve, and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering if there's any possibility of not Shoigu, because I think he and Putin are just glued to the hip. But is there any possibility that in the military there would be some sort of a forceful movement?
Yeah, I mean, military coup is something that Russian leaders for centuries and Soviet leaders have made sure didn't happen. Look what happened to Zhukov. It's theoretically possible. I'm not sure what the mechanism would be there. And, this is a system run by people from the KGB, and they certainly have ears everywhere. So, that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. It would be very, very difficult to pull that off. But it's true, because they're being blamed now. When Prigozhin and Kadyrov and those people fulminate against what's happening, they blame the military. Obviously, nobody blames Putin. So,
just one second. I just want to say, Emerita, who is, he's a famous historian, and when I was writing my very first article on the KGB in 1987, somebody smuggled us a book by Emerita, the KGB. Yes, it was still the Soviet Union, and somebody who worked the KGB, in fact, smuggled us your book. Emerita also wrote a famous book on Beria, Stalin's first lieutenant, and your latest book, Orders to Kill, right? So just so for those in the audience or on the web who are not that much familiar, don't recognize Emerita by face, I think you would want to know that she's the one who is asking questions. So thank you very much for coming, Amy. Yes, please.
You mentioned the energy crisis in Europe. I would be very interested to hear your opinion on the Nord Stream situation, on the reasons, or like the hypothesis, who was it, and also
we didn't talk. We didn't talk.
We didn't.
No, we didn't. But I asked this question.
Oh, okay. And also probably looking forward, like after in the bright and beautiful future, after everything is over, given that it's severely damaged, how would Europe behave in reestablishing, or will it behave in reestablishing the gas supply from Russia?
So on February the 23rd, Russia was an energy superpower. In fact, I remember at one of the Valdais, I asked Putin, is Russia an energy superpower? And he said, oh, superpower, that's a very Cold War term. And then he paused and he said, but we do have more energy than anyone else, so no one should forget that. But I think as a result of the war, it won't be an energy superpower anymore. I mean, it's still making a lot of money, obviously, now because, you know, they have the agreement with OPEC and they're reducing or they're constraining production there. So prices are still very high. But I think this war will break the pattern, right, of the majority of Russian gas exports going to Europe. All the pipelines were going that way. You know, there are a couple of pipelines now to China, but it won't have that same cloud anymore. Plus, you know, if the world moves more towards renewables, the demand for hydrocarbons is going to, and the Russians have known this for some time, the demand for hydrocarbons will lessen, and therefore their major source of income won't be, you know, they won't be able to make as much anymore. So I think in general, its clout as, you know, as an energy superpower will be declining. Now, I don't know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, people say the Russians did, other people say, well, maybe it was someone else. I do not, I mean, again, having just been in Germany and listened to these discussions, I do think that the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, realize they made a mistake by becoming so dependent on Russian, particularly gas, and that they're not going to do that again, and that they are finding alternatives now, and they will find other alternatives, and they're not going to go back. You know, to, you know, let's say the war is over, to somehow restoring these pipelines. Although it, you know, it's true that for 50 years, the Russians were reliable suppliers of gas to Germany, to West Germany at least, and then Germany, not always to Eastern Europe. But they're not seen as such anymore, and they're seen as kind of weaponizing, you know, the energy lever there. But we may never know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yes, please.
So at the beginning of the discussion.
Would you please just name yourself, because, you know, anonymity, Echo Moskvy doesn't allow for anonymity, and, you know, maybe Jordan Stent is easy on that, but still, you know.
My name is Anna. I'm
Okay.
a PhD student here at NYU in the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much for this incredibly interesting discussion. I have one question. So at the beginning of the discussion, you painted Putin as an actor who is driven primarily by his desire to undo the collapse of Soviet Union. But as far as I understand, when Putin first came to power, his incentives were quite opposite to that. In your opinion, what did change in the span of 20 years that made him change his opinion?
So I have to tell you that I've talked to people who, Westerners who knew him in St. Petersburg when he was a deputy mayor. And they said even then, you know, it was this not accepting the collapse of the Soviet Union was something on his mind. I mean, also think about his personal life. There he was, a KGB case officer, you know, living the life in Dresden, and then suddenly everything collapsed, and you know, the world that he had envisaged for himself collapsed. Of course, he didn't do badly out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is true that in his first term in office, or at least till 2003, he did appear as if he wanted better relations with the West. He made a famous speech in the Reichstag in Berlin, which was very forward-looking. You know, he at one point asked whether Russia could join NATO, and he seemed to be more interested in integration with the West. You know, one of the turning points was the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2003, and then the domestic clampdown and all, you know, that. And then I think. But I think that the thing that he became disillusioned with, let's say, was really after 9/11. So in the fall of 2001, that's the high point, you know, of US-Russian relations, certainly in the last 30 years. Russia was, you know, was supportive. Obviously, we had similar goals. The Russians also wanted the Taliban to go, and they were, you know, helpful with information and things like that. And I think what Putin thought that he was going to get from supporting the US in this effort in Afghanistan was essentially a recognition of at least a right to a Russian sphere of influence. I mean, we come back to Ukraine now, but the US would recognize that, and it wouldn't go on trying to support the independence of a number of post-Soviet states. And when it was clear that he didn't get that, and then we can add on all the other grievances, the color revolutions, the war in Iraq, things like that. But I think all of that, you know, turned him very sour on the United States. And then obviously, if, once he made the speech in the Munich Security Conference in 2007, it was clear that he was already very angry with what the United States had or hadn't done. So I think his expectations of what was going to happen after the fall of 2001. I mean, we have to remember, he visited President Bush. He went to the ranch in Crawford, Texas. I remember going to the Russian embassy when he was there in the fall of 2001. He made a speech there. It was all good feeling and, we're going to work together. And it sort of deteriorated fairly quickly. So, but then, what's the relationship of that to sort of relitigating the end of the Cold War? I mean, I think what he had hoped for was a recognition that Russia had a right to a sphere of influence, that Ukraine wouldn't look westward. And that, of course, it soon became clear that that was not going to be the case. So I think the two things are tied, but I do think that his expectations and his mindset changed when he didn't get what he thought was his due. It's really very different expectations, very different understandings of what the relationship should look like.
Yes, please.
Leo, also a graduate student at NYU. Looking at draft dodging from a few weeks ago, it was devastating from media coverage in the US. What was the reaction domestically in Russia and the media coverage of it?
Well, the media coverage, I guess you could probably say more about the media coverage in Russia. I mean, interestingly enough, in the beginning, I don't know how many hundred thousands of people have left since they announced the partial mobilization.
About 1 million.
1 million just of the drought? No,
No,
I thought it's
since
1
the
million
beginning
is
of the war.
everything, right? So I think it's at least 200,000 or 300,000 young men have left. And in the beginning, they let them leave because I think in the beginning they didn't want domestic unrest. They didn't close the borders, right? They could have. Then it started to get more difficult, and there are reports of them going into hotel rooms and dragging people out. You going into people's private apartments and taking them out. The way it was covered in the official media was obviously you have to do your patriotic duty, and it's a partial mobilization, and we're fighting Ukrainian Nazis or Satanists or whatever the flavor of the day was. But they do appear to have been able to have mobilized maybe not all the troops that they want to do, but many of them. But of course, what you do see, and that's of course not the official media, are all of these accounts now that you can see on YouTube that are emerging of how badly equipped they are, that they're being told they have to take all of their own equipment, that the army isn't giving them anything, of rusted Kalashnikov rifles. And then the reports, that they go to the front, they're not properly trained, they don't have the training, and then they come back in body bags. And there's quite a lot of that out there now. And I was just watching yesterday something on YouTube of a larger group of people who were about to be deployed, who were really complaining, and their families. So do you want to say anything else about the media coverage of this?
Putin said that 220,000 people were drafted. Zona Media just recently reported that about 400,000 people were drafted to the front lines. We don't know the real numbers. What we do see, and what is covered extensively in the social networks, that these people, they don't have, these soldiers, these troops, they don't have ammunition, they don't have weapons. They are not supplied even, with food and with water. So there is a lot of controversy about that. We know that some of them running back to their cities, but there's still, there was just one case initiated against somebody who left, the front line. So we yet to see the outcomes, but I think, in the upcoming, couple of weeks, we'll see a lot of problems with that. Yes, please, Josh.
So thank you so much. This has been fascinating and so interesting to hear all your takes on this. I'm going to ask two questions that are not related to each other. My first question, which is what I wanted to ask, was So I was interested in the same question about, what happens with Putin how does Putin get removed from power? But you answered that question. So I'm going to ask the opposite of that, which is there an off-ramp for Putin which does not involve either escalation, so some dramatic step where he gets to claim victory, or him being removed from power? Is there a way that we go from kind of the status quo to an end to the fighting, or does something dramatic have to happen for that to change? That's my first question, which I'm really curious about your take on this. The second question just is a reaction to what you were saying about going back to 9/11 and how what Putin really thought is this would mean, Ukraine would never go to the West. And we keep hearing this going back and forth. Putin's disappointed about Ukraine. Ukraine is the thing that is super important to him. And so my question is, not to be facetious, but why the obsession with Ukraine as opposed to other things? And the reason I ask this from the point of view as a political scientist, but a domestic politics person, not an IR person, because my line following 2014 was, if you want to get a pro-Russian government into power in Ukraine, and there's not one, just wait till the next election, right? The Ukrainians continued to have government after government that disappointed its population. It had for ways that people like Luke and Wei have sort of brilliantly laid out. Neither side had the ability to consolidate autocratic power. And it seemed like it was never really going to, the Ukrainian people just did a perfectly good job of getting rid of whatever government was in power. And much like Moldova, much like some other countries, it was going back and forth between pro-Russian, pro-Western, and that this only really changes dramatically after the Russians do the functional equivalent of, you want to elect a Republican president, but you annex Texas, right? How are you going to elect a Republican president without Texas? How are you going to elect a Russian president without Crimea anymore? So the Russians changed things. They put in place, starting in 2014, this set of events that finally makes Ukraine really dramatically anti-Russian, whereas it wasn't from the first 25 years at all. And without the annexation of Ukraine, probably you would have continued to have this seesawing back of power. But then the annexation of Crimea, Crimea takes out the most pro-Russian voters, right? As does, getting out some of these more pro-Russian areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. And now all of a sudden, you then have 8 years to develop this Ukrainian civic identity, which people like Ola Onek have sort of brilliantly chronicled this. And you get this more crystallization of this Ukrainian identity. And then you go and do 2022, and you guarantee that the number one feature of this Ukrainian civic identity for the next 30 years is going to be anti-Russian. Right? So where did this come from in the beginning? How did we get from this? It's like he's willed his own nightmare into being by his own actions over the last 8 years. So why was it always and you seem to have insight into this from early on. This has always been interesting to me, why so obsessed with Ukraine? I think this is the way the history books will write the story, that there wasn't anything there to be really worried about, and he sort of willed into existence exactly what he was worried about. So where did it come from in the first place?
So it's a great question. So if you even go back to the 90s, right, it was incredibly difficult even for Yeltsin to get together with successive Ukrainian leaders. I mean, he did finally sign at the end of his tenure, they signed an agreement on friendship and cooperation. They recognized each other's borders, but it was extremely difficult. The Black Sea Fleet was part of it. Crimea was part of it. So, I mean, I think you can go back and say in general, right, Russians have tended to look upon Ukrainians, as their little brothers. I mean, in the Soviet period, of course, you had some Ukrainian nationalism in there, and Ukrainians were disproportionately, I think, important in the military and things like that. But this didn't begin 30 years ago, right? It's this contested history and contested identity, and every so often Ukrainians have tried to break away, and they've had very brief periods, well, 2 of them, of independence and things. So that I see in a long historical phase, and even this fighting over who does Volodymyr or Vladimir the Great belong to, and all of this. So, and so even in the 90s, it was not as if, and I remember, you know, in 1991 and 1992, going to meetings where people were saying, is there going to be a nuclear war between Ukraine and Russia? So it was quite clear, even the beginning was very hard for the Russians to accept the independence of Ukraine. And as you've characterized it, Ukrainians themselves were sort of ambivalent about a lot of this. And this is why there was such a push by the Clinton administration to get the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons, you know, with the Budapest Memorandum and everything else. Now, I think it's possible that, you know, why does Putin have this obsession with Ukraine? I don't have a good answer to that. He clearly does. Where does it come from? I'm not sure. I mean, he's never, you know, when he talks about this, you wouldn't know why that is so. But again, I would say there are, you know, it's also characteristic of, you know, large numbers of Russians that they have this sort of feelings about Ukraine. I mean, there was all this at the beginning of the war, people going back to Joseph Brodsky, right? The famous poet, exile, came to the United States, who wrote these terrible things about Ukrainians. And even Navalny, right, at some point in the past was also, you know, a little critical. So I think,
sure, Navalny is half Ukrainian, his father is Ukrainian.
right.
But Navalny said something, you know, when he was asked about Crimea after the annexation, he said, it's not a sandwich. You cannot just pass it by back and forth. That's what he said. And he said that, you know, people of Crimea should have voted, you know, should have a real referendum. That's what he said. No, he never said anything anti-Ukrainian. It's impossible. Half of them, you know, if you go to Chernobyl or to, you will find a hell of a lot of Navalny's there.
Right. Yeah. Anyways, but I think it's part of the, you know, this is part of Russian tradition, not viewing Ukrainians as being really something separate. And of course, Putin has done everything he can. He's created Ukrainian national identity. He's, you know, he's made the Ukrainians incredibly anti-Russian, which is, you're right, many of them weren't. And I think, also, I think making the mistake of thinking, because many Ukrainians, obviously Russian's their first language. I mean, Zelensky, Russian's his first language too, but that doesn't mean that they identify with being Russian. Off-ramp, it's very hard to see what that is. I mean, would Putin at this point, if Zelensky were willing to accept this, which that's another question, but would Putin be willing to accept, okay, we've annexed these 4 territories, we've got what we wanted, let's sit down, sign peace negotiations and go home? I mean, he might be, but he doesn't give any sign of that. So I don't know what the off-ramp is.
Let me ask, you know, question from, you know, I will go back to you, but, you know, first let me ask you. So Jennifer Long, okay, your discussion began with intelligence gathering methods in the US and Russia. Given how badly the war in Ukraine has gone for Russia, how do you think this will affect Russian intelligence services, communications, etc.? Does Putin acknowledge this failure?
Well, he obviously hasn't publicly acknowledged it. There were rumors at the beginning of the war, right, that there were several individuals in the, particularly in the FSB unit that was dealing with Ukraine, was in Ukraine. Right, exactly, that they were somehow arrested or whatever, but then somebody else said, well, maybe that's not true. No, so it's not true. Okay, so they don't seem to have suffered from this. I mean, you know, we're in the problem in Russia is, you know, it's essentially, well, a very authoritarian state. Maybe we call it a dictatorship by now, but no one wants to tell the boss something that he doesn't want to hear. So that obviously affects maybe not people's understanding of what's going on, but what they're prepared to communicate to him. And I think in the case in Ukraine, obviously the people who were there must have just been talking to a certain group of Ukrainians and not the ones that were necessarily supporters of Zelensky. So there should be, I mean, you would think that in a, you know, if something like that happened in the United States, there would be a reckoning here and people would really have to look into what they did wrong, and you know, some heads would roll, but I'm not sure whether that's going to happen in contemporary Russia.
Stephen Barnes, it seems that perhaps Putin is banking on authoritarianism being able to outlast democracy because it doesn't have to answer to its population. So he thinks bringing pain in the winter will cause populations in Germany to pressure their government to lean on Ukraine and to end this war in a way favorable to Russia, or perhaps that the midterm elections will bring Republicans to power in the US Congress who would conceivably cut off funding to Ukraine. Is it possible that if the coalition holds together in their support of Ukraine through the winter, and assuming some continued Ukrainian military victories, that Putin might have his eyes opened already and be more reasonable come spring? Can you talk about these or some other scenario of how you think the war might actually end?
That's another very tough one. Well, I think, first of all, Putin was wrong. One of the many mistakes he made at the beginning was he didn't think there would be US allied unity. He thought the US, after the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, wouldn't be in a position to have a coherent policy. Well, he's been wrong on those counts up till now, but for the reasons we already talked about, there are more strains, obviously, on this coalition. I don't know if the coalition holds together and we're still, there's still unity, like say next spring. I'm sure he's going to be surprised by that. Is he going to learn anything from it? I'm not sure that he is. Scenarios for ending the war, we've talked about some of this already. It's very hard to believe that Russia could actually be defeated. I know that, people in the Biden administration say Russia can lose the war. It's hard to imagine that, even if they're running out of ammunition, they still, it still has a large army and it has the potential to get things. I mean, there could be a scenario where the Ukrainian population really suffers so much with all of these continued attacks on the infrastructure and the energy and everything, that at some point people start to say, we can't go on with the suffering anymore, and maybe we should think about a negotiation. Obviously, Ukraine isn't anywhere near that yet, but that's, it's theoretically possible that could happen. But otherwise, I think most people think that this is a war that's going to go on for quite a long time. Through next year, maybe through the year after that, there'll be more intense and less intense phases. But it doesn't look as if it's going to be over anytime soon.
There is a new saying in the amateur circles. We say next year in Moscow. So
you can always be optimistic.
Yes, some people do this for centuries. Okay. Yes.
So, Noah Buckley, I'm a visiting scholar here at the Jordan Center and assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin. So I think you touched on part of what I was going to ask about. But I sort of wanted to flip Josh's question earlier on its head a little bit, and it seems clear that Putin, this is not his first preferred outcome, how the war has gone so far. We covered that. Probably not even his second best sort of outcome. But it seems like I have a sneaking suspicion that he's sort of okay with how things are going. I mean, Russian lives, he doesn't care about that. The Ukrainian economy is, shattered, and it's hard to see how that's going to recover anytime soon. Sure, things haven't gone right. The West is still united, and Ukraine taking back the territory. So I guess in this sort of, let's say, 3-5 year scenario that you just mentioned, where Putin manages to freeze things as they are, more or less right now, lose some territory, gain some territory. Ukraine's economy is not going to get any better. The West continues to supply HIMARS rockets, but doesn't do a whole lot more than that. Is there anything that the West can do, or what's the perspective for this 5-year sort of simmering conflict? And what can the West do? What, sanctions conditional on something as opposed to just sanctions for sanction's sake? Or is there any hope here?
Well, I do think that the impact of the sanctions is going to be felt much more next year. Now, it's true that the Russian economy has done better this year than people thought it would, given the sanctions. But all of these export controls, Russia's inability to access semiconductors, parts, replacement parts. I mean, you're even reading that, they're running out of spare parts for their own airplanes. They've stopped manufacturing certain cars because they don't have the parts for that. That is going to get worse. And, factories will close down. So the condition of the economic condition for many Russians will be significantly, I think, worse next year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate into a change in Russian policy, but I think we have to wait and see the full impact of that. Right now, of course, Russia's still making a lot of money from selling hydrocarbons, as the prices are high, but there will be, I think, other impacts of sanctions on people's daily lives. Those sanctions have to be kept. You are right. I mean, this could go on it's not really a simmering conflict when you're destroying energy infrastructure and things like that, but it can go on for quite a long time. And short of the West and the US, so, what the US has done is supply the Ukrainians with the weapons so that they can push back against the Russians and not lose. But it hasn't supplied with them with the wherewithal to win, whatever that would mean, but in terms of being able to reach into Russian territory and having better air defenses. I'm not sure that consensus will change. I think one thing that could change is obviously if in 2024 you have a Republican president, then you could have the US, deciding it's not going to support Ukraine anymore, depending on who it is. And then that would mean it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians. And that might be a way that the war would then wind to an end just because the Ukrainians can't continue to fight back.
Yes, please.
Camila, I'm a graduate student at Columbia University. Thank you for your time here, and also thank you for your book. It's a wonderful book. I just wanted to see if you could possibly comment on Russia's use of or the lack of use of the cyberspace, and what could possibly be the future if you see that kind of developing further, since it would make more sense in terms of asymmetric warfare.
So I think people have said on the one hand that they're surprised that there hasn't been more cyber interference by the Russians. But, when I was in Germany, they reminded me a few weeks ago, the trains in northern Germany stopped functioning. Well, they fixed that, but it took some time. So there are things that have happened, which you, of course, can't attribute maybe to anyone, but it certainly hasn't been as extensive as people thought it would be. And then so that gets to the very interesting question, do they not have the capability to do it, or are they deliberately not doing it? Because, of course, one can retaliate against that too. But that has been an interesting aspect of this conflict so far.
Yes, please.
Hi, Dmitry, or actually Dmitro Yarmenko, a proud Ukrainian citizen, and thanks a lot for the conversation. This was very enlightening and super interesting. Maybe a slightly different question, because we talk about Russia and Putin a lot, but I think we kind of don't talk a lot about the other side opposing the Putin, the opposition in Russia, and maybe some citizens that are kind of, a lot of them are in exile, a lot of them have fled the country, fleeing mobilization, yet we don't see any type of resistance to that with people, leaving their lives behind. And for instance, if we compare like protests supporting Iranian movement right now versus still some, Ukrainian hate going on from some of the immigrants from Russia and Europe and so on. What do you think is the best course of action for the Russian opposition right now that, with a lot of FBK and even some of the bad apples like Sobchak fleeing Russia recently, is there a way to unite all that population in exile and actually, turn the tide on?
I think Yevgenia is the better person to ask. I mean, the problem, so we have, this is the largest emigration, I think, since the revolution. And the problem often with the Russian liberal opposition is that they tend to be at each other's throats a lot, that they're not united. I was just in Berlin and met with one opposition figure and then found out that he's been attacked by the Navalny people. Anyway, so some of that unfortunately goes on, that there are people and they oppose what Putin's doing and they want to do something about it, but they have trouble coalescing. There isn't one leader. Well, now there's Navalny, but he's in prison, but sort of of the exile people that, there's not one person. Khodorkovsky has formed one group with a number of exiles. So, their strategy obviously is to wait and hope that a different Russia next year in Moscow will emerge where, their towns can be used. I mean, the problem inside Russia is the disincentives to protest are so great that, you risk arrest, jail, and that's why we haven't, this is very, I mean, again, it is more or less a dictatorship now where you cannot express your views. The only thing that Putin has done that's different from the Soviet Union is to leave the borders open so that people can leave and it's less likely that there will be maybe rebellion there. So I would say that the most important thing would be to try and get the many Russians who are in exile to sort of not be at each other's throats. But what's your reaction to that?
I think, that one problem is lack of leadership. Of course, Alexei Navalny was the one who was capable both to bring people on the streets but also, to inspire people from all stratas of the Russian society. And now he's sitting in jail. And the second, of course, it's became extremely dangerous. 16,000 people were arrested, since the beginning of the war because of, whatever protests they had. And Putin was smart to leave borders opened. He basically, he allowed, all this, dissatisfaction to get out. And people, listen, more than 1 million young people, predominantly male, age 20-40, they left the country. And these are the kind of energy which came out in 2011, 2012, and thousands and thousands of these people who came out when Navalny returned back, and people in 180 cities across the Russian Federation protested. No longer, all of them are gone. I don't believe in popular mobilization now. I don't think that in this kind of regime you can afford for that. I think that there will be, some sort of, elite politics. I do think that there will be a coup d'etat. So many powerful people did their best to steal Russian budget for this ongoing 22 years. They worked so hard to steal as much as they could. And now they cannot use their facilities and their lands and their villas, in French Riviera. And, for what? To live inside a country that they don't like, which, in the conditions they hate, with all these women who are demanding from them Chanel and everything else, and they're unable to provide this. And they, listen, it's a real trouble for them. So anyway, but I'm very grateful. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and I would like you to join me to thank Professor Angela Stent for this absolutely amazing, excellent presentation, and for your time. And thank you so much. It was amazing. Thank you.